Thank you. You may be seated. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to the next member of our Follin Speaker Series. As you know, the Follin Speaker Series is an endowed series endowed by the Follin family in memory of G. Webb Follin II, class of '38. And I'm pleased to say that G. Webb Follin III, where is he? I see him, class of '73, is here today. So please stand up, Mr. Follin. Good to have you here. You may not recognize him with a tie, but I think he's come to more basketball games in the last few years than any of us. So he's the super fan of basketball as well. But we're delighted to thank you so much from your family, on behalf of your family, for all you've done for us with this series. It's brought so many interesting people to the school. So Dr. John McCardell, currently the 16th Vice Chancellor of University of the South Sewanee and President Emeritus of Middlebury College, is a distinguished historian and respected national leader in liberal arts education. A 1971 graduate of Washington and Lee University, he did his graduate work at the Johns Hopkins University and then at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in history. His specialty is United States history with a special emphasis on 19th century, the Old South, and American historiography. He possesses a record of achievement as a scholar and is author of The Idea of a Southern Nation, published in 1979, which received the Allen Nevins Prize, as well as many essays and book reviews in addition to that. He has also written extensively on student life and liberal arts colleges. He has served on the chair of board of directors of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, as chair of the Division III President's Council of the NCAA, and on the boards of Episcopal High School and Washington and Lee University. He currently serves on the board of the Tennessee Independent Colleges and Universities Association, the Porter Goud School in Charleston, South Carolina, and is a member of the Board of Managers of the South Carolina Historical Society. He will be stepping down as Sewanee's Vice Chancellor in the summer of 2020 after 10 years of service. And we were talking about that. He's retiring to Beaufort, South Carolina. If you've never been there, it's one of the prettiest little towns in the world, isn't it? Absolutely. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. McCardell.
Thank you so much. We've all been in settings like this where the speaker begins by asking if those in the back can hear, and I'm trusting that I'm projecting sufficiently with the help of the mic, but I'm always amused, and perhaps you found yourselves in these situations as well, where the speaker says, can those in the back hear me? And one hears in loud voices from the back, no! Think about that. So if I'm not projecting, signal me, but I hope that we're doing just fine. I'm delighted to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation, and particularly because of the many affinities, I think, that the University of the South and the Webb School share. Among those are the regular number of graduates of this school who have found their way to the mountain. And I hope that one result of my visit here today will be to continue that never-failing succession. But also because I discovered that we actually opened our doors only about a year apart. Though the University of the South was a gleam in the eye of a group of Episcopal bishops in the 1850s, and though they raised a lot of money to lead to the opening of the university and the laying of the cornerstone, that commemoration occurred in October of 1860. What those founders possessed in vision, in other words, they utterly lacked in timing. Because 1 month later, Lincoln is elected, the southern states secede, 4 years of war follow, every penny contributed to the university is lost. 2 of the 3 founding bishops are dead, and the 3rd would die within a year. There are no buildings, there's no money, there is seemingly no hope. And yet, in the spring of 1866, a small group returns to the mountain, determined that if the idea of a comprehensive private Episcopal university had merit in the years before the war, it had even more merit and even greater necessity afterwards. And so they persevered, knowing they were on the clock. The gift of land from the Sewanee Mining Company in 1858 had a condition. You may keep these 5,000 acres that we have given you, that gift said, if you open your doors within 10 years. They're on the clock, in other words, when they get to work in March of 1866. But they get to work, they raise the money, they recruit the students, they build the buildings, and just in the nick of time, enroll the first class in the fall of 1868. So our foundings, our actual openings occurred at just about the same time. And we share, I think, so very much more in terms of the kinds of students we seek to attract, the kinds of students we seek to graduate, the ethos of our campuses that our students inhabit, an ethos reinforced by the presence of those students, and the pride we take in what those students go on to accomplish as representatives of our institutions in their communities, wherever they may wind up. And so I'm deeply appreciative for all of those reasons to have this opportunity to speak to you, and I hope you'll find what I have to say over the next few minutes to be of some value. Now, you know the old story, what does it mean when a preacher takes off his watch? Absolutely nothing. But I will try to be respectful of your time as well as mine, and to allow time for questions from the audience, if questions there be. I was talking with a group of students and faculty at lunch about what is emerging in historical study as a very new field. If you have spent time studying history, you probably know of the familiar categories. There's political history, there's social history, there's intellectual history, there's diplomatic history. All of those tend to take a chronological narrative approach, and so we study political history from then till now, diplomatic history from then till now. Increasingly, and in more recent times, the study of history is taking on a more topical nature. And one of the ways in which that change has manifested itself is in this relatively new field of study that we call historical memory. And in no field, in no subject, is there more active participation, more frequent publication, and more eager engagement than the place of the American Civil War in our own collective historical memory. Now, historical memory matters. Memory helps us define and shape our understanding of an event, but also our understanding of ourselves. Memory is selective. One can't remember everything. And so because it is selective, it involves a process of choosing what to remember, and if only inadvertently and by default, choosing what not to remember. And so when one takes a subject like the Civil War and examines how it has been studied and understood and remembered over more than 150 years, one can witness some very interesting changes in that determination of what is more or less important, what needs to be remembered and what ought to be forgotten, what can't be forgotten under any circumstances, and how we order and prioritize those elements of memory that allow us to construct a coherent and plausible narrative of what happens. I've done a class for many years, first at Middlebury and more recently at Sewanee, on just this topic, the Civil War in American historical memory. And when you think about the kinds of texts you would use and the types of materials you would expect to examine in a course on historical memory, you can begin to understand that the course of study, the syllabus from one year to the next, could be completely different the next time around, and still provide a rich and diverse set of materials with which to understand just what the memory of the Civil War ought to be. because there is both a temporal dimension to that. How was the war remembered by the participant generation? How was the war remembered by the successor generation? How the war was remembered by the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those generations. So how has our sense of memory evolved and changed over time? But also, what are the materials that give us the greatest and most reliable access to how that memory has been captured and sustained and transmitted? And so in addition to the usual textbooks and the usual anthologies of documents, one can read letters, one can read diaries, one can look at film, one can look at fiction, one can listen to music, one can study architecture. In all of these ways, and in so many other ways, one can see various ways in which the Civil War has been remembered. What is most important? What is most important about what is most important? What under no circumstances can be overlooked or forgotten? And what perhaps seems less important now than it may at one time have seemed. So with that by way of introduction, I want to delve into a very, very specific example of what I'm talking about. That is the way in which the two presidents of the two competing entities, Abraham Lincoln, of course, for the Union, and Jefferson Davis, of course, for the Confederacy, each, in his own way, sought to define what this war was all about, how it needed to be remembered, and what was so urgent about transmitting that memory across and beyond the generations. Now, one of the things that strikes the student of historical memory is the way in which the first group of attempts to remember the war appears. And in the years immediately following the war, I wouldn't want to say there is an avoidance of the topic, but there is an uncertainty about how to engage the topic because it has been so recent. It has been so penetrating. It has affected everyone. More than 600,000 battlefield deaths. Almost everyone in this country, north or south, knew someone or was related to someone who was killed or wounded in the Civil War. And the memories of that war, whether you were on the winning side or on the losing side, were so powerful and were so painful that it shouldn't surprise us at all that during the years immediately following the war, the attempts to tell its story were infrequent and when undertaken, rather more often than not, exaggerated and therefore in the longer run, unreliable. But beginning in the middle of about the 1870s, enough time has passed that we begin to see the first of what becomes a large and continuous spate of memoirs appearing. And among the things that are discovered is that the public seems to have an almost insatiable appetite for these memoirs. And if you go back and Google Civil War memoirs from the 1870s, 80s, into the 90s, you will discover that by the time this process has run its course, you can find the history of almost every battalion, every brigade, every regiment, every army, and just about every general that fought in the war. Either a biography of them or memoirs written about them, or at the very least a muster roll of everyone who served in them. And it is remarkable, and technology has put this within greater reach, that if you had a relative who fought in the war, chances are you can find out who that person was, what unit they belonged to, what battles they participated in, everything about that war experience. Now understand, this is almost, in the earliest generation, almost entirely about the military experience. Now, that should come as no surprise either. Other aspects of the war, equally important, ultimately aspects of the war, don't take center stage, at least during this first generation of output when it comes to memoirs. These are written first-hand accounts by people who were there about the experience that they had. And probably the single most conspicuous and successful example of all of these publications, and I would recommend this to you if you want at least to experience a sample of what I'm talking about, are the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. There's a wonderful story about that alone. General Grant, of course, was arguably the most successful of all the Union commanders. He was a consummate strategist and tactician. He had a strategy in mind for winning a battle, for winning a war, and he also had a strategy in mind for writing a memoir. And his personal memoirs are beautifully written, and they provide a very, very succinct, because he was succinct, and also selective account of what his war experience was. What makes the story even more interesting is that he has lost virtually all of his money in a series of bad investments. In the middle of the 1880s, he discovers his dying of cancer. In order to provide funds for his family to live on after his death, he undertakes the writing of his memoirs. It's a race against time, a race that he wins, not against death. No one wins that race, but at least against his publisher's deadline, so that these memoirs are published and they earn the income and the wide notice, positive public notice that they receive. So if you're looking for a good example of what I'm talking about that might whet your appetite for even more, check out the personal memoirs of General Grant. But my two subjects today are writing about their own particular experiences, but are attempting to encapsulate in their own words and for their own understanding, but also for the understanding of posterity, what this war was all about, why it mattered, and how it ought to be remembered. Now, that cause would understandably be perhaps more urgent, likely more urgent, for the representative of the lost cause than the representative of the prevailing cause. And so it was that Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and let's stop and think about this for a moment. I always ask my class, choose your revolution, choose your rebellion, choose your country, choose your century, and ask yourself, how do winners of civil wars usually treat losers? I dare say that there is a single exception to the answer of that question, which is generally mass liquidation, expropriation, and discrediting for all time. And that one exception is the Civil War in the United States, where only a single Confederate is executed, and that the commander of the notorious Andersonville prison, and where the leaders of that rebellion, the leaders of that revolution, those who led the failed cause, or if you will, the lost cause, are on the whole treated rather gently, considering that their goal was to create a separate nation and essentially to separate themselves by an act of revolution from the country to which they had once belonged. So the mere fact that Jefferson Davis is alive and well and able to write these memoirs is striking, and I would argue exceptional, because I doubt you will find too many leaders of failed revolutions invited, as Jefferson Davis was invited, to tell his side of the story. That's another topic for another lecture at another time, but at least suggests something about American either naivete or magnanimity, to the extent that those two things are different, that this volume even appears. Well, Jefferson Davis had had a long and, on the whole, quite distinguished political career. He was a hero of the Mexican War. He had served in Congress. He had served in the Senate. He had served in a presidential cabinet. And believe it or not, he was, though unsuccessfully, ultimately, a candidate for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1860. And one of his most ardent supporters at the Democratic Convention of 1860, actually are two from Massachusetts, Caleb Cushing and Benjamin F. Butler, the same Benjamin F. Butler whose command of troops during the Civil War was so notorious. So Davis cut a national figure. Davis had a national profile. Davis was legitimate presidential contender. But when his state and his region secedes, and though he might have preferred that someone else had been chosen, he is elected, first the provisional and then the final president of the Confederacy. Now, Davis's mind was of a very legalistic turn. Jefferson Davis saw things as an attorney would likely see them. And so when he finally sits down to write The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, which appears in print in 1881, it runs to 1,500 pages. Now, unlike Grant's Memoirs, this is not a runaway bestseller. That has only partly to do with its length and only partly to do with its weight. It has at least as much to do with its writing style. This is essentially a 1,500-page legal brief. Some of you may have stayed up last night or will stay up tonight or tomorrow night to watch what's been happening in the Senate and the presentation of legal briefs on first one side and then the other of the impeachment proceedings. I doubt that even when every single syllable uttered through the entirety of this trial, if every single syllable were captured and bound and published, it wouldn't run to 1,500 pages. But imagine subjecting yourselves to having to read even a fraction of that. Well, Davis sets himself to work. He is writing, in effect, an apologia, which doesn't mean apology. It means an explanation. It means a justification. It means my attempt as a member of the participant generation to pass on to posterity what this war was really about. This is urgent. This is necessary. And it must be understood. And I'm going to make absolutely certain that there's no mistaking what my view is, because I'm going to give you 1,500 pages about it. Now, parts of this are very riveting reading. But unfortunately, the publishers of these two volumes don't indicate in boldface or colored type or some alternative to the printed word just where those riveting passages occur. But I want to give you several examples, and this is going to seem a bit boring, but then it is, to give you a flavor of what it was he was saying and how it was he was saying it. It is well known that at the time of the adoption of the federal Constitution, African servitude existed in all the states that were parties to that compact, unless with the single exception of Massachusetts, in which it had perhaps very recently ceased to exist. The Constitution expressly forbade any interference by Congress with the slave trade, or to use its own language, with the, quote, migration or importation of such persons prior to the year 1808. During the intervening period of more than 20 years, the matter was exclusively under control of the respective states. Nevertheless, every southern state, without exception, either had already enacted or proceeded to enact laws forbidding the importation of slaves, Virginia was the first, Georgia was the first to incorporate such a prohibition in her constitution. And he goes on to explain at great length that these southern states where slavery existed were part of something that was not simply regional, not simply sectional, but national. There was slavery in the North as well as in the South, and there was common consent that by 1808, 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution, the slave trade would be eliminated. Furthermore, that Congress should have no authority to interfere in the emancipation of slaves or in the treatment of them within any of the states. So distinct and final was this statement of the limitations of the authority of Congress, considered to be that when a similar petition was presented 2 or 3 years afterward, the clerk of the House was instructed to return it to the petitioner. This gives you an idea of what is on the other 1,499 pages. It is detailed, it is footnoted, and it is making an argument that, in fact, we were all pretty much alike. This is especially true, he goes on later, with regard to that familiar but most fallacious expression, the extension of slavery. Now that, of course, was the position of Lincoln and the Republican Party in 1860. We're not opposed to slavery where it exists, say the Republicans. We're opposed to the extension of slavery. That is a fallacious expression. To the reader unfamiliar with the subject, you, but not for very much longer, or viewing it only on the surface, it would perhaps never occur that is used in the great controversies respecting the territories of the United States. It does not, never did, and never could imply the addition of a single slave to the number already existing. I'll not go on to read the rest of this to you because I think you get the point from that segment. The government is the machinery established by the Constitution. It is the agency created by the states when they formed the Union. Here is a particular theory of constitutionalism, that it was the states that formed the Constitution. It was the states that brought it into being by ratifying it through a special convention. By extension, only the state could change its mind about ratifying the Constitution, and that, in fact, is what South Carolina did in December of 1860. They didn't vote to secede from the Union. They voted to undo their ratification of the Constitution in 1788, the result of which was they were no longer a part of the Union. This was a voluntary act entered into, and it was an act that could be subsequently voluntarily made to withdraw. And so I need not then go on to argue, though he does, from the history and nature of our government that no power of coercion exists in it. The states had the right to withdraw, and the federal government had no power to interfere with that assertion of state sovereignty. We've seen that the United Colonies, when they declared their independence, formed a league with one another as United States. And interestingly, there was a documentary done in the early 1990s and recently redone on public television, which some of you may have seen, and if you haven't, you should track it down. Ken Burns' The Civil War. At the end of that 11.5-hour slideshow, which is really what it is, but you don't realize you're watching an 11.5-hour slideshow because it is so artfully presented. One of the historians says, what was the significance of the Civil War? And he says, Shelby Foote says, that's simple. He said it changed the subject-verb agreement from the United States are to the United States is. Well, that's exactly what Davis is saying here. They were called the United States. This title antedated the adoption of the Articles of Confederation. It was assumed immediately after the Declaration of Independence, was continued on the Confederation, and this style of confederacy shall be the United States of America. The name was not adopted antithetical to or distinctive from Confederate, as some seem to have imagined. If it has any significance now, it had the same under the Articles of Confederation, or even before that. Well, I could go on, but I won't, because I think I've already pressed to the limits of your patience and I hope made my point. that this is an elaborate, it is a detailed, it is a frequently tedious, but it is also, at least from Jefferson Davis's point of view, an airtight argument to explain why secession was justifiable, that this had nothing to do with slavery. It was all about the assertion of a state's right voluntarily to withdraw from the compact, and that withdrawal was necessary because certain constitutional agreements had been violated by the other side. So you can go track down the remaining 1,498 pages. If you like, you'll find more of what I hope I have reasonably succinctly summarized for you. So let's now turn from Jefferson Davis and his really quite formal and legalistic and comprehensive understanding of what the war was all about to Abraham Lincoln's interpretation. Now, Lincoln, of course, did not live to write a memoir. Lincoln's life was cut tragically short in Ford's Theater in April of 1865. So if we're going to look for Lincoln's attempt to pass on to posterity what his view of the significance of the war was, we have to look at one or another of his public utterances. And there is no better place to look for that than at the Gettysburg Address. So we go from 1,500 pages to 3 paragraphs, several hundred words. And you certainly know the gist of this if you don't know it by heart. There was a time when school children learned this by heart. If you're going to learn one thing by heart, this is a pretty good thing to learn. And it's worth repeating. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So now let's unpack this. Let's go the next level down. Let's see what Lincoln is really saying. So the colors are there for a purpose. 87 years ago. Now, that's not very complicated math. 87 is how much? 87. Well done. Okay. 87 years ago. Gettysburg Address is delivered in 1863. 1863 minus 87 is what? It's 1776. So in 1776, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Now, what happened in 1776? In 1776, the United Colonies declared their independence from England. But it would take a tremendous leap in logic to derive from that act and that decision the creation of a nation. These were 13 independent colonies, and that's what they say in 1776. And the first attempt at nationhood doesn't occur until 1781 with the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, and that first attempt fails. It fails so badly that a second convention is called at the end of the decade to try to make things right, to correct the defects in the Articles of Confederation, to write something new called a Constitution, and to make that the basis of a nation. It is a bit far-fetched to say that on July 4th, 1776, a nation existed. What's Lincoln up to in asserting something that is arguably not true or even close to being true? Well, let's look at the next red word. Proposition. Proposition. If you think back to the wording of the Declaration of Independence, you may remember a passage in it written by Jefferson that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The fact that all men are created equal is, in Jefferson's formulation in 1776, a self-evident truth. But now, 87 years later, in the midst of civil war, a self-evident truth has become instead a proposition. A proposition. Now, what is a proposition? Well, a proposition, like a proposal, it is something put forward. It is a topic before the House. It is up for discussion. It is up for debate. It is up for resolution. It may get voted up. It may get voted down. It is not a self-evident truth. We don't debate self-evident truths. We do debate. We go to war over propositions. Propositions are fragile. Propositions are feeble. Even the most noble of propositions can fail. That is why Lincoln says that this great Civil War is a test. It is a test of that proposition. And it is a test of the fact that whether that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. Truth has become proposition. There is a lot at stake here, folks, and it hasn't been settled yet. Those red words, in many ways, are the most important of those in the address. But I would call our attention briefly to the green and then also to the blue. If you look at what is highlighted in green, something should strike you. Brought forth, gave their lives that that nation might live. These dead shall not have died in vain. New birth of freedom. Lincoln knew his King James Bible. Though Lincoln was not a particularly conspicuously practicing Christian, he knew the language and he knew the biblical cadence. And if you think about the language that he uses in this particular address, you can hear those biblical cadences resounding. Brought forth. Mary brought forth her firstborn son. Giving a life so that the nation might live. Greater love hath no man than laying down his life. Not in vain. New birth. Rebirth. Born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. This is biblical in its essential framework. And so he's talking about a fragile proposition. He's talking about it in language and in cadences that even the least literate among his hearers would understand, because this was language that was familiar. And then finally, we look at those words in blue. Look at the number of times the word or the variation on dedicate is used, and the different ways and the different meanings of dedication in the address. This is, in other words, a place where a cemetery is being dedicated, but also where a people and a cause is being dedicated, and dedicated to unfinished but urgent and important business, so that that new birth might occur, so that that proposition might prevail. Lincoln manages to say in a handful of words what the Civil War was all about. For Jefferson Davis, it was all about a contract. It was all about a contract being violated. It was all about the legalisms of the convention at Philadelphia, and it took 1,500 pages to make that case. For Abraham Lincoln, it had nothing to do with the contract. It had nothing to do with the Constitution. It had everything to do with what came before. This is why, in some ways, they're talking past each other, because in a certain way, each one of them is right. If one sees the war as being principally about a contract being violated, one can at least begin to see some element of persuasion in the Davis definition. But if one is rather willing to see, as Lincoln saw it, the transcendent, extra-contractual, spiritual element, which has nothing to do with those mechanisms by which nations are created or defined, but everything to do with fundamental truths about human nature and human equality and human possibility, then it is Lincoln's version that has been transmitted across the generations to the historical memory of our own time. But let's not overlook the fact that to Lincoln, as for us, what may at one moment have been a self-evident truth had become a proposition to be tested. And it is being tested still. Thank you all. I think we have a few minutes for questions from the floor, and I am happy to take them, and I'm confident that when I need to be gonged, the gong will sound so you can get on to wherever it is you have to be next. Okay. Is that a hand? Great. Let me put my glasses on. Yeah. So I can hear you better.
What does the war mean specifically, personally to you?
I'm sorry?
What does the war mean personally to you?
I can try to give you a succinct answer to that. The question is, what does the war mean personally to me? I've always thought about the war as part of a larger process of national self-definition. That the United States at the time of its founding, wherever you date that founding, was an incomplete, inchoate thing. It was not a nation in the modern sense. And a lot of what happens during the first half of the 19th century is an attempt to define just what American nationality is, just what American nationhood is, and just what those things are that sets America apart from the rest of the world. Is it language? Well, other people speak English. Is it art? Well, we don't really have any yet. Is it literature? Well, we need to get on with producing an American literature, but we don't have that either. What is it about this country that sets it apart? And particularly after 1815, and you can find copious references to this. What does it mean to be an American, and how do we define Americanism and American nationality? And Southerners are as much a part of this exercise as everybody else. And if you take writers, for example, they set themselves to work writing about those things that are most familiar. Well, if you're William Gilmore Simms in South Carolina, what do you know? You write about the southern states and the Revolution. You write about plantations. You write about slavery, because that's what you know. That's how you contribute to the store of national literature. And these things are all part of the national story. If you're Nathaniel Hawthorne writing in New England, you write about New England. And you say New England is about as large a lump of earth as I am able to comprehend. But this is how I'm contributing to the national story. So what is going on is this process of definition, which ultimately leads to a process of inclusion and exclusion about what is American and what is not. And so in the end, in my view, and in a very abridged answer to your question, the Civil War is ultimately about the definition of American nationhood and what falls within that definition and what does not. It was not and probably never could have been settled by force of argument. It could only have been settled by force of arms, and so it was. If I'm just not seeing you, yell out. Yes, thank you, good.
You spoke a lot about the memoirs going after the war, and I was wondering if, even after World War II, a lot of the generals on the east side wrote like, they'd only taken Moscow, they'd only done this one specific thing, would have turned it all around, and we would have won the war.
Yep.
How much of if we'd only done this thing that I said, we would have won the war went on in Confederate memoirs?
If only Longstreet had attacked on time, right? Well, counterfactual questions are always interesting because they don't have a single correct answer, but they're filled with might have beens. First of all, I guess I would augment my answer to the previous question by saying, or by adding, that in whatever I may have said in response to it, I was not implying right and wrong or good and evil. That I believe that everyone who participated in that contest believed that they were good Americans and were striving for America as they understood it. I think that may help explain why there was some unusual and uncertain activity, at least on the battlefields, that might not otherwise be able to be explained. One looks at McClellan, for example, as he moves up the Virginia Peninsula in 1862. The rules of war, at least early in the war, was that they did not involve civilians, that civilians were exempt, and so you protected private property. You didn't interfere with those private citizens. War was between soldiers. And so McClellan was respectful of the civilian population. Sherman, of course, was not, but by then, 2 years later, the war had changed dramatically, and Sherman waged total war. Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley waged total war. And Grant in Virginia waged total war. And it was only when that began to happen that the fortunes of war truly began to shift. And the weight of superior manpower and resources and the rest began ultimately to prevail. So what might have made the war turn out differently? That's very hard to say, because I think if you look at the assumptions that the war planners had at the beginning, they assumed exactly what didn't happen. Southerners thought that the longer this war goes on, the better it's going to be for us, because the Northerners will finally get weary and they'll simply say, let them go. So if we can just hang on long enough, we'll wear them down, and the longer the war is, the better it is for us. Northerners said, nope, it's got to be quick. We got to win a quick military victory. It's got to go on. We are more likely to prevail if we can go in and strike a knockout blow. Well, of course, it goes exactly the opposite way. The longer the war goes on, the stronger the North becomes and the weaker the South becomes. The early and most severe blows are struck by the South, not by the North. And so one might answer your question by saying, well, if the war planners had gone into this with a set of assumptions that more closely approximated the reality. The war might have turned out differently, by which I would mean not simply that a different side would have won, but it wouldn't have gone on as long. That's turning out differently as well. And up until the Emancipation Proclamation, there was always a chance, a remote chance, but a chance, that reunification could take place. But Lincoln, when he writes the Emancipation Proclamation in the fall of 1862, says, you've got until January 1st of 1863, and if you're not back in the Union by then, I'm signing this thing, and those slaves are free. That may not have been the turning point, but it was a decisive moment because it changed the nature of the war unmistakably from a war to restore the Union to a war to end slavery. Yes, sir.
At the end of your presentation, you mentioned that the proposition is still being discussed. How do you see that playing out in today's world? Sort of the definition of the United States national character.
Boy, if I knew the answer to that question, I could probably make a lot of money and probably get elected to political office, and neither one of those things is going to happen, and nor is my answer going to be particularly insightful or accurate. I think the more diverse we have become, the more pluralistic our society has become, the better that has been for each and every member of the culture. But the harder it has become for us to find principles around which we can genuinely unify as a people. And frankly, I think the students in this room, we must have confidence in them because they're going to be wrestling, I think, in a much more challenging way with that proposition, certainly than my generation, which tried and had some marginal success, but certainly not complete success, attempted to do. And that is the great challenge of nationhood going forward. It is the great challenge of civil society going forward. Can we not only embrace but live out the self-evident truth or the proposition that all men are created equal, make allowance for the fact that we are all, by definition, as human beings, flawed and imperfect, acknowledge that our goal is not foremost to praise or to blame, but to understand, and that perhaps the study of history can help us get a little closer to the achievement of that proposition. But I don't think we should deny or even shy away from the reality of that challenge, because I think it is serious, it is fundamental. Lincoln recognized its fundamentalness, and if we as educators can come even close to preparing these young people to understand that and to work within their communities to achieve it, not without struggle and not without setbacks, and to make it less personal and more civic, less personal and more communal, the better likelihood we have of success. One of my favorite quotations is Benjamin Franklin, who just before he goes up to sign the Constitution says, yes, this document is flawed. If I had my way and if I could write it, I wouldn't write it the way it's been written. There are things in it that I have questions about. There are parts of it that I think may not work. But listen, folks, it's time for us to get on with it. It's time for each of us to doubt a little in our own infallibility and make the best we can of this imperfect human document that we've created. Well, it seems to me that one of the principles that might be embraced and rearticulated as we seek to work out the testing of the proposition is for each of us to doubt a little in our own infallibility. All right.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
That was a heck of an oration, don't you think? I mean, not one note is up here. And even answering the questions, John, you show your great scholarship. So thank you so much for being with us today. And God bless you all. Please rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Dr. McCardell could be here for a few more minutes if you have a private question you'd like to ask him. Seniors first.